Now, some say, I'm showing you an image here. This is from a professor in Pittsburgh. She sent me this picture of the cell antenna right in front of her 3-story home as it was being put up. And she had to leave. She had to leave her home because she couldn't get that tower down. Now, there's a woman in, actually, there's several letters that we have from the FDA from parents that have written the FDA and said, can you help us with this? Because when they wrote their local authority, they were told that the FDA said that 5G was safe, that these installations were safe. And we have several letters online that basically say what I'm about to quote you with. So one mother, this is a California mother, wrote the FDA, and the FDA wrote back. Ellen Flannery, the director of the FDA Office of Policy Center for Devices and Radiological Health, she's an attorney at the FDA in January 2022, wrote back, the FDA does not regulate cell towers or cell tower radiation. Therefore, the FDA has no studies or information on cell towers to provide in response to your questions regarding the safety of the cell antenna in front of her home. Now, if the FDA is not addressing this, who is? Well, in fact, there is no health agency, no federal agency with health or environmental expertise addressing cell tower or 5G radiation. None. There is no agency, only the FCC, which states that it is not a health and safety agency. So it defers to other federal agencies for information regarding the safety in the health and science issues. However, there is no other agency to defer to because there is no one else doing this. And it is a egregious omission. It's such a lack of accountability. It's really no words, right? No words. So when I wrote the EPA on this, and I have several letters to the EPA, they're all online in Environmental Health Trust, and I asked them questions about the issue of cell towers and 5G and impacts to children and memory. They wrote me back the same thing in several lines with the answers to every question. I asked, when have you last reviewed the issue? They said EPA's last review was in the 1984 document, Biological Effects of Radiofrequency Radiation. The EPA does not currently have a funded mandate for radiofrequency matters. And this is the cover of their last report there in 1984, where they looked at and put together all of the science that they looked at. 1984 is a long time ago. Here we have an example of what's happening, right? This is actually a cell tower right on top of a building, right down the road on New Hampshire Avenue. And it's disguised, but it is cell tower antennas right there. Here's low-income housing in Michigan. A woman there wrote me, this is what her window, and she's got an antenna right outside of her window. And there's nothing that she's been able to do about it. She can't even get the data on it. They won't even give her the information on even what are the frequencies coming out of it. And she's really been struggling. So this is an environmental issue. It is a social justice issue. And some people are able to move and some people are not. There are, for example, in my community in Montgomery County, the majority of cell towers are on schools where there are kids with higher free lunch rates, higher minority populations compared to other schools where cell tower might be proposed, but it gets cut down immediately by the local neighbors or the community that opposes it, and they're listened to. Whereas in other communities, even when there's opposition, they can't stop these towers from going up. So it's a whole other issue that I talk about in a lot of other presentations that we have online. Now, I'm going to briefly dive into this huge issue, which is the environmental issues related to 5G and cell towers. And there's a very important article that was published by Erica Rosenberg She is a former FCC lawyer. She was the assistant chief at the Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division at the FCC for many years. She has retired, and she published an article called Environmental Procedures at the FCC, a case study in corporate capture. And she talks about how the FCC has failed to follow the environmental laws. And I'm going to read a quote that kind of summarizes everything she talks about in this article. The result of the FCC's lack of accountability is cumulative and incalculable environmental damage. Views of protected landscapes and historic sites ruined, wetlands filled, endangered species habitat cleared, sacred sites desecrated, burial mounds and archaeological sites disturbed, and fragile underwater environments degraded. Please take a look at this article. I also interviewed Erica, and that's up on our YouTube channel and on our website, Environmental Health Trust. Now, the Department of the Interior in 2014 wrote a letter to the FCC saying the electromagnetic radiation standards used by the FCC continue to be based on thermal heating, a criterion now nearly 30 years out of date and inapplicable today. And that letter also documented birds. And Albert Manville, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist who was the lead on cell tower impacts to birds and bats, now retired, has published and has written the FCC and has spoken out on this issue just for years now, cautioning about the impacts to wildlife, to flora and fauna. And this is a whole issue which I'm going to share with you a bit about today. And actually, let me scroll down to that. Then I'm going to scroll back up. So the environmental levels are increasing, those ambient levels in the air. And there's people that, our health is important, but also impacts to birds and to insects, pollinators. This is, animals roost on cell antennas. We know that these levels of radio frequency are increasing in the United States. That's been documented by studies that have been published. We wish there was more research. The U.S. government is not funding research on looking at this issue, but there is some research, of course, showing this. There's a major publication, a landmark research review by U.S. experts, Albert Manville, Dr. Henry Lai, science writer Blake Levitt, that looked at over 1,200 studies on the effects to flora and fauna and found biological effects at vanishingly low frequencies comparable to today's ambient exposures. Effects were impacts to orientation and migration, food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, and also genotoxic effects. And this three-part review is so important. Please find, go to the study online. It's called Effects of Non-Ionizing Electromagnetic Fields on Flora and Fauna. Rising ambient EMF levels in the environment is the first one. Then they have a second one on how species interact. And then the third one on policy changes that need to happen. Download these. They are open access. Send them to your elected officials. And we need accountability on this issue because birds nest and perch on transmitting cell antennas. But instead, we have trees that are fake trees with antennas on them. Just egregious. Published research on bees and on pollinators, they found impacts to the activity, motor activity, biochemical changes indicating stress, the induction of the worker piping signal, and that is in natural conditions. The worker piping signal announces the swarming process of the bee colony, or it's a sign of a disturbed bee colony. But when a study where you put a cell phone inside a hive, and then one that's on and one that's not on, and they found the induction of the worker piping signal. And there have been studies showing decline in colony strength, and the queen egg laying rate impacts the honey production. And yet we have products that promote, Amazon Echo Dot kid speakers, wildlife, Save the Bees cell phone case. There's another honeybee cell phone case. So I'm going to hop back to where I was before to go back to this issue of actually sensitive areas, because I skipped over a section. I want to hit back because I'm reading some of your questions as well. So I want to make sure I address what other countries are doing. Many countries have schools and homes as sensitive areas. They don't allow cell towers near homes, or they have more stringent exposure limits, as I showed you in that graph. Chile, Greece, Israel, India, many locations in India, Switzerland, Turkey, and Belgium. And they also post the levels of wireless radiation that are circulating in the air, and they measure them. Many countries do this, not the United States. France, Greece, Turkey, Italy, India, Israel, French Polynesia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Tunisia, Switzerland, Bahrain, Iceland, and actually many more. We have on our website a section on policy where you can read all of the countries that are doing this. And let me give you an example. This is a website from Switzerland where they actually show the levels that they've measured in different areas. They have maps. You can click on the maps to see the levels of exposure. Here you have a picture from Senegal, where this is a car that has a measuring device on the top, and they are driving that car around the community, testing what the levels are, and then they post reports. Now, these countries might have a limit that's similar to the US, but at least they're measuring what the levels are. At least they're checking for compliance. Now, the way they check is not necessarily the best way to measure in terms of biological impacts, but it is so much more than the US. We do not measure what the levels are. The federal government has no field testing. They don't go around measuring, making sure cell tower sites are even compliant. In fact, they rely on the companies themselves to produce reports from their consultants about whether their cell tower sites are compliant or not.